Imagine the sound of 4,000 men breathing in a space built for 800. The wet, heavy air of tropical Africa trapped behind 30-foot concrete walls that were already cracking before Mozambique gained its independence. Picture keys that no longer fit their locks. Guards carrying hammers not as weapons, but as tools to force open doors that should turn with a simple twist. This is Maputo Central Prison on March 15, 2016. Built in 1967 for $16 million in today's money. Designed by Portuguese engineers who had never experienced a 40-degree African summer. They created a machine for containing human beings, but they built it with European assumptions about African realities. For 50 years, this machine operated beyond every limit its designers imagined. Overcrowding that turned cells into suffocation chambers, mechanical systems corroding in salt air that ate through steel like acid, food rations stretched so thin that hunger became a permanent condition for thousands of men trapped in a structure that was already failing before they arrived. The official records tell one story. The forensic evidence tells another. Today we're opening the classified files on Africa's most devastating prison collapse. We're examining the engineering reports that were ignored, the maintenance logs that documented systematic breakdown, and the human cost of 50 years of institutional blindness. This isn't just the story of a riot. This is the anatomy of inevitable failure. The mathematical certainty that occurs when human systems ignore the laws of physics for too long. Join me as we reconstruct the day when concrete, steel, and human desperation finally reached their breaking point. When the walls that were supposed to contain chaos became the source of it. The walls rise from Maputo like broken teeth against the African sky. 30 feet of concrete and steel, cutting through the heart of a city that never asked for them. You can see them from the fish markets where vendors hawk their daily catch. You can see them from the bus stops where commuters wait in the morning heat. You can see them from the primary school playground where children press their faces against chain-link fences, wondering what lies behind those towering barriers. This is Maputo Central Prison. Built in 1967 under Portuguese colonial rule, it was designed to hold 800 men. Today, it houses over 4,000. The mathematics are simple, the consequences are not. But this story doesn't begin with overcrowding. It begins with geography, with the peculiar decision to place a maximum security facility less than 2 miles from the city center, where the Indian Ocean breeze carries salt into every crack and crevice, where the seasonal rains arrive like clockwork each December, turning concrete courtyards into shallow lakes, where the tropical heat never drops below 25 degrees Celsius, even at midnight. The Portuguese engineers who drew these blueprints had never lived through a Mozambican summer. They had never felt what 40-degree heat does to human skin pressed against concrete for 16 hours a day. They had never calculated how quickly salt air corrodes steel hinges, or how monsoon moisture seeps through mortar joints that were mixed for Mediterranean climates. They built a European prison on African soil, and like so many colonial legacies, it was designed to impose order without understanding the forces it would need to contain. Walk the perimeter today and you'll notice something unsettling. The prison walls don't create a buffer zone between incarceration and freedom. Instead, they slice directly through residential neighborhoods like a concrete knife. Markets press against the eastern wall. Apartment buildings rise within 50 meters of the guard towers. Children play soccer in lots where they can hear the echo of voices from the exercise yards. Urban planners call this a proximity violation. International standards require at least 500 meters between high-security facilities and civilian populations. Maputo Central Prison has less than 100. The city grew around the prison faster than anyone anticipated. By 1990, what was once an isolated compound had become an island surrounded by humanity. This matters more than you might think. Prisons rely on psychological distance as much as physical barriers. When inmates can hear car horns and street vendors through their cell windows, when they can smell grilled corn and diesel exhaust mixing with disinfectant and desperation, the walls become porous in ways that concrete cannot prevent. The original architectural surveys from 1966 reveal something troubling. The site was chosen not for security advantages, but for bureaucratic convenience. Close to the courthouse, close to police headquarters, close to the colonial administrative district, where Portuguese officials could oversee operations without venturing too far from their air-conditioned offices. Security was secondary, convenience was primary. This inversion of priorities would echo through every crisis that followed. In the archives of the Mozambique National Library, you can find the original construction contracts, signed in Portuguese, typed on carbon paper, filed in manila folders that now smell of decades and neglect. The specifications are precise: reinforced concrete walls 36 inches thick, steel bars manufactured in Lisbon and shipped to Maputo Bay, manual locking mechanisms imported from a factory in Porto that specialized in bank vaults. But there's something missing from these documents. No mention of ventilation systems adequate for tropical humidity, no provisions for drainage during the 6-month rainy season, no calculations for thermal expansion when concrete heats to 50 degrees Celsius under direct sunlight. The Portuguese built for Portugal. In Mozambique, this became a fundamental design flaw. The walls themselves tell the story. Visit the northeast corner where the morning sun hits first, and you'll see hairline fractures running vertically through the concrete. These aren't structural failures. They're thermal signatures. Every day for 50 years, the prison has expanded and contracted with the temperature. Concrete and steel responding to forces the original engineers never computed. By the late 1970s, salt corrosion had already begun its quiet work. The steel reinforcement bars embedded in the walls started oxidizing from the inside out. Rust blooms like slow cancer through the concrete matrix. What begins as discoloration becomes weakness. What begins as weakness becomes failure. But failure takes time. Concrete doesn't collapse overnight. Steel doesn't snap without warning. Infrastructure dies by degrees, and the administrators who inherit these buildings often mistake gradual decline for acceptable wear. Maintenance records from the 1980s show a pattern of deferred repairs. Cracked mortar joints noted but not filled. Corroded hinges reported but not replaced. Lock mechanisms that required increasing force to operate, until guards developed calluses on their palms from wrestling keys that no longer turned smoothly. Each delay compounded the next. Small problems became medium problems. Medium problems became crises, waiting for their moment. The prison that emerged from independence in 1975 was already showing stress fractures, not just in the concrete, but in the entire system of assumptions that held it together. The Portuguese had departed, taking their institutional knowledge with them. The new Mozambican administration inherited buildings without blueprints, systems without training manuals, problems without solutions. Independence changed the flag flying over the guard towers. It did not change the fundamental arithmetic of 800 beds trying to accommodate an ever-growing population. The early post-independence reports speak of optimism, plans for rehabilitation programs, discussions of prisoner education initiatives, dreams of transforming a colonial punishment facility into a modern correctional institution. These documents gather dust in filing cabinets now, their edges yellowed with age and unfulfilled promises. What they don't discuss is load-bearing capacity, the amount of human weight that concrete floors and steel frameworks can safely support. When the prison was designed, engineers calculated for 800 inmates distributed across specific cells and common areas. They assumed normal movement patterns, normal furniture loads, normal stress distributions. By 1980, the population had doubled. By 1990, it had tripled. By 2000, the original capacity was nothing more than a historical footnote. The prison wasn't just overcrowded, it was structurally overloaded. Concrete has memory. It remembers every load, every stress, every force applied to its surface over decades of use. When you exceed design parameters consistently, concrete begins to fatigue. Microfractures develop in the aggregate matrix, steel reinforcement shifts by millimeters, foundation settlements become uneven. The prison was literally sagging under the weight of its inhabitants. In the maintenance workshop, you can still find the original tool inventory from 1967. Hand-forged keys hanging on hooks, their metal worn smooth by thousands of rotations, lever systems for manually operating cell doors, springs and counterweights that relied on human strength rather than mechanical assistance. This wasn't primitive technology, it was appropriate technology for its time and context. Manual systems are reliable when properly maintained. They don't fail during power outages. They can't be hacked or remotely compromised. They last decades with basic care. But they have one critical vulnerability. They depend entirely on human attention. Miss a lubrication schedule and moving parts seize. Ignore a worn spring and mechanisms fail. Defer replacement of corroded components and the entire system becomes unreliable. By the late 1990s, guards were carrying hammers along with their keys. Not as weapons, but as tools for persuading locks that had forgotten how to turn. The prison security had degraded to the level of percussive maintenance. Each morning brought a ritual of mechanical negotiation. Guard stations where officers spent 10 minutes wrestling with door mechanisms that should have opened in 10 seconds. Key rings heavy with backup keys for locks that no longer matched their original specifications. Improvisations and workarounds that became standard procedure. Security through redundancy was replaced by security through hope. Hope that the locks would hold. Hope that the repairs could wait another month. Hope that the system would continue functioning despite operating far beyond its intended parameters. Hope is not a security strategy. The irony of Maputo Central Prison is that it succeeded brilliantly at its original mission. For the first 5 years of operation, it was exactly what its designers intended. A facility that could house 800 inmates with adequate staffing, proper maintenance, and reasonable oversight. A machine designed for a specific task, performing that task efficiently. The problem wasn't the design. The problem was the decision to keep feeding more people into a machine that had already reached its optimal capacity. Every successful prison operates on ratios: guards to inmates, square footage to population, calories to consumption. These ratios aren't arbitrary. They're mathematical relationships that define the difference between control and chaos. When you double the inmate population without doubling the guard staff, you don't just have efficiency, you create exponential vulnerabilities. When you triple occupancy without expanding the physical infrastructure, you don't just reduce comfort, you undermine the fundamental assumptions that make containment possible. The original blueprints for Maputo Central Prison represent a moment of clarity. Engineers who understood load limits, architects who calculated sight lines, administrators who budgeted for maintenance cycles. A brief period when the relationship between human beings and the structures that contain them was carefully considered and properly planned. What followed was 50 years of forgetting these calculations existed. In the basement of the prison administration building, there's a room filled with ledgers, handwritten logs dating back to opening day. Each entry records the arrival of new inmates. Names, crimes, sentences, cell assignments. The handwriting changes as different clerks take over the record-keeping duties. The ink fades from black to blue to ballpoint scratches. But the numbers tell an unmistakable story. The steady accumulation of human beings in a space designed for a specific limit. 800 becomes 1,000, becomes 1,500, becomes 2,000. The pages grow crowded with notations about doubled and tripled cell assignments, overflow populations sleeping in corridors, exercise yards subdivided to accommodate more bodies in the same square footage. By the early 2000s, the admission logs had become archaeological evidence of a system consuming itself. Each new name represented another increment of pressure applied to walls and floors and support beams that had already exceeded their design tolerances. The prison had become a time bomb built from human bodies and bureaucratic indifference. The only question was when the mathematics would overwhelm the infrastructure, when the slow accumulation of stress would finally exceed the capacity of concrete and steel to contain it. Every building has a breaking point. Every system has a threshold beyond which order becomes impossible. Maputo Central Prison had been approaching this threshold for decades, one admission at a time, one deferred repair at a time, one overlooked warning sign at a time. By 2015, the machine was running so far beyond its specifications that failure had become inevitable. Not failure of will or intention, but failure of physics. The simple, implacable reality that materials have limits and systems have capacities that cannot be exceeded indefinitely without consequence. The walls were still standing. The locks were still turning mostly. The guards were still showing up for their shifts. But underneath this facade of continued operation, every structural element was operating in a state of barely contained crisis. The prison looked stable from the outside. From the inside, it was already falling apart. The only question was whether it would collapse gradually over years of continued decay, or suddenly in a moment of catastrophic failure. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. The alarm sounds at 5:30 every morning. Not an electronic buzzer. Those broke years ago and were never replaced. Instead, it's the sharp clang of a guard's nightstick against the metal water pipes that run through the cell blocks. The sound echoes through corridors designed for 800 men, now packed with over 4,000. In cell block C, the morning count takes 47 minutes. It should take 12. But when you have 6 men sleeping in a space designed for 2, when makeshift hammocks hang from ceiling fixtures never intended to bear human weight, when inmates have carved out sleeping spaces in corners that don't appear on any architectural plan, counting becomes an archaeological exercise. Guard Sergeant Manuel Santos has been conducting morning counts for 17 years. He knows which cells hold double their capacity and which hold triple. He knows which inmates sleep standing up because there's no floor space left. He knows which cells have improvised second levels built from stolen mattresses and scavenged wood planks. What he doesn't know is how many people are actually in his section on any given day. The official count hasn't matched the real count since 2008. By 2015, the discrepancy had become so large that administrators stopped trying to reconcile the numbers. 3,700 inmates according to the official registry, over 4,000 according to Santos's daily tallies. The difference isn't administrative error. It's the gap between bureaucratic reality and physical truth. This matters because everything in a prison depends on accurate counts: food portions, guard assignments, emergency procedures, medical supplies. When you don't know how many people you're responsible for, you can't calculate how much of anything you need to keep them alive. The kitchen receives funding for 3,700 meals per day. It serves over 4,000. The mathematics are unforgiving. Each inmate's daily calorie allocation drops from 1,800 to approximately 1,400. Enough to prevent starvation, not enough to prevent hunger. Hunger doesn't cause riots immediately. It accumulates like compound interest. Day after day of insufficient food creates a baseline of physical stress that makes every other problem worse. Tempers shorten. Patience evaporates. Small conflicts escalate faster when everyone is operating on empty stomachs and shortened sleep. The prison kitchen tells its own story of institutional failure. Built to serve 800 inmates 3 times daily, it now operates like a wartime field kitchen feeding an army division. Industrial cooking equipment designed for moderate use running 16 hours a day. Refrigeration systems that break down monthly under the strain of constant operation in tropical heat. The head cook, Maria Fernandez, has been improvising for over a decade, stretching rice portions with filler, watering down stews to increase volume, rotating protein sources based on whatever's cheapest at the Maputo markets that week. Her kitchen operates more like a relief operation than a correctional facility food service. But even emergency rationing has limits. By mid-morning, the breakfast portions are gone and inmates who woke up late go without. By evening, dinner becomes a competition where the strongest eat and the weakest wait for tomorrow. The kitchen hasn't fed everyone adequately in years. Food distribution follows the informal hierarchies that develop in every overcrowded prison. Established inmates eat first. Newcomers eat last, if at all. Gang leaders maintain their own food reserves through tribute systems that the administration pretends not to notice. Guards receive regular offerings from inmates who understand that small gifts can mean the difference between a decent meal and prolonged hunger. These aren't corruptions of the system. They're adaptations to systemic failure. When official mechanisms break down, humans create unofficial alternatives. When the prison can't feed everyone, the prison's inhabitants develop their own methods of resource distribution. But unofficial systems are unstable by nature. They depend on continuous negotiation and regular displays of power. They create winners and losers, predators and victims, temporary alliances that shift with every change in population or circumstance. Most importantly, they make the prison's actual power structure invisible to administrators who continue making decisions based on organizational charts that bear no relationship to reality. The lock mechanisms tell their own story of institutional decay. Maputo Central Prison operates with the same manual locking systems installed in 1967, heavy iron keys turning in mechanisms that were already showing wear by the 1980s, springs that have lost their tension, tumblers that stick in the humid air. Each morning, Guard Corporal João Mutamba begins his shift by testing every lock on his assigned corridor. Turn the key left, then right. Apply pressure while rotating. Listen for the click that indicates proper engagement. Repeat for 47 cells, 12 security doors, and 6 emergency gates. The process takes over an hour. It should take 15 minutes. But when mechanical systems operate beyond their intended lifespan, routine maintenance becomes a daily ritual of coaxing cooperation from unwilling metal. Mutamba carries a toolkit that would look familiar to a 19th-century locksmith. Small hammers for percussive persuasion, wire brushes for cleaning corroded tumblers, oil cans for lubricating mechanisms that should have been replaced decades ago, a collection of backup keys cut by hand to match locks that no longer conform to their original specifications. Every guard develops their own techniques for managing reluctant hardware. Some use graphite powder to reduce friction. Others prefer a specific sequence of pressure and rotation that encourages cooperation from worn mechanisms. A few have learned to identify which locks are approaching failure by the sound they make when turning. This institutional knowledge isn't written down anywhere. It passes from veteran guards to newcomers through informal apprenticeships. When experienced guards retire or transfer, they take their mechanical expertise with them. The prison gradually loses its collective understanding of how to operate its own security systems. By 2010, the prison was employing guards who had never worked with properly functioning locks. The jerky, hesitant operation of corroded mechanisms seemed normal because it was all they had ever experienced. They developed muscle memory for mechanical failure rather than mechanical success. The psychological impact of unreliable security systems extends far beyond operational inconvenience. Guards who spend 20 minutes wrestling with door mechanisms lose confidence in the infrastructure they depend on for safety. Inmates who hear the daily struggle with reluctant locks begin to understand that the barriers containing them are more fragile than they appear. Security depends on the perception of inevitability, walls that cannot be breached, doors that will not open without authorization, systems so reliable that testing them seems pointless. When inmates witness guards struggling with basic mechanical functions, the illusion of institutional competence begins to dissolve. Every stuck lock becomes a small demonstration of system vulnerability. Every broken mechanism becomes evidence that the prison's barriers are maintained by improvisation rather than engineering. Every delayed response due to mechanical failure becomes a lesson in the gap between theoretical security and practical reality. The guards know this. They see the expressions on inmates' faces when keys refuse to turn and doors stick in their frames. They feel the shift in atmosphere when routine procedures become visible struggles with uncooperative equipment. They understand that their authority depends partly on smooth execution of mechanical rituals that no longer execute smoothly, but they continue their shifts because prisons must be staffed, regardless of the condition of the infrastructure. They continue wrestling with reluctant locks because the alternative is leaving cells unlocked. They continue improvising solutions to mechanical problems because proper repairs would require shutting down sections of the facility for weeks. Cell Block A houses the overflow population, inmates sleeping in corridors because there are no empty cells, makeshift partitions constructed from bed sheets and scavenged materials, sleeping areas that exist in the gaps between official architecture and human necessity. The corridor floors show the wear patterns of this improvised occupancy. Concrete polished smooth by thousands of bodies lying directly on cold surfaces. Drainage grates clogged with accumulated debris from areas never intended for human habitation. Electrical fixtures jury-rigged to provide lighting for spaces that were designed as transitional passages, not living areas. Senior inmates control the most tolerable sleeping locations. Spots near windows where tropical breezes provide some relief from the stifling humidity. Areas close to water sources and functioning toilets. Positions that offer visual privacy from guard stations and main circulation routes. New arrivals sleep wherever space can be found, against walls still radiating heat from the day's sun, in narrow gaps between institutional furniture never intended to accommodate human bodies, on concrete floors without cushioning, using their own clothing as inadequate bedding. The overcrowding creates a hierarchy of desperation. Inmates who have been in the prison longest occupy the spaces that most closely resemble actual accommodation. Recent arrivals endure conditions that would violate international standards for the treatment of animals, but even established inmates live in conditions far below the minimum requirements for human dignity. Cells designed for single occupancy now house 6 people. Personal space measured in inches rather than feet. Privacy that exists only in the brief moments when cellmates look away. The psychological pressure of constant physical proximity cannot be overstated. Humans need solitude to maintain mental stability. They need personal space to regulate stress and aggression. They need the ability to withdraw from social interaction when emotional resources become depleted. Maputo Central Prison provides none of these necessities. Instead, it creates conditions where psychological breakdown becomes inevitable, where small conflicts amplify into major violence because there's no space for de-escalation, where mental illness spreads like contagion through populations that can never escape each other's immediate presence. The ventilation systems reveal another layer of institutional failure. Designed for 800 people, they now attempt to circulate air for over 4,000 bodies, generating heat, moisture, and carbon dioxide in spaces never intended for such occupancy. The air in Cell Block C becomes noticeably thinner after sunset. Not metaphorically, measurably. The concentration of oxygen drops as human respiration overwhelms the capacity of mechanical systems designed for much lower population density. Inmates report headaches, dizziness, and difficulty sleeping in the stale atmosphere of overcrowded cells. Ventilation grills designed to move fresh air through the facility now struggle against the humid exhalations of a population that exceeds every engineering assumption. Fans that should run intermittently operate continuously, their motors overheating in the tropical climate. The mechanical systems are dying from overwork. Electric motors designed for moderate duty cycles running 24 hours a day until bearing failure and coil burnout become routine maintenance emergencies. Ductwork corroded by constant humidity and salt air, developing leaks that reduce airflow efficiency year after year. But the real crisis isn't mechanical, it's atmospheric. The prison has become a closed system where the air itself becomes contaminated by the sheer number of people breathing it, where carbon dioxide levels rise to concentrations that impair cognitive function and increase aggression. Sleep becomes difficult when oxygen saturation drops below optimal levels. Tempers flare more easily when brain chemistry is affected by atmospheric composition. Decision-making deteriorates when the air itself cannot support proper neurological function. These aren't abstract concerns. They're measurable conditions with documented psychological effects. Overcrowded spaces create cognitive impairment that makes rational behavior more difficult for everyone involved. Guards and inmates both operate in an environment where the air quality itself undermines judgment and emotional regulation. The daily count reveals the mathematical reality behind every administrative euphemism. Official occupancy, 3,700 inmates. Actual occupancy, 4,237. The difference, 537 human beings who exist in the physical reality of the prison, but not in its bureaucratic imagination. These uncounted individuals represent more than statistical error. They represent complete systemic breakdown. people who consume resources without official allocation, bodies that generate heat and waste without corresponding infrastructure support, human beings whose presence makes every aspect of prison operations more difficult while remaining invisible to the administrators making policy decisions. The uncounted inmates sleep in areas not designated for human habitation. They eat from food allocations already insufficient for the official population. They use sanitation facilities designed for numbers that have no relationship to actual demand. They exist in the gap between theoretical capacity and practical reality. Most critically, they don't appear in emergency evacuation plans. When administrators calculate escape routes and assembly points, when they determine staffing levels and security protocols, when they order medical supplies and safety equipment, they base these calculations on numbers that underestimate actual population by over 10%. This isn't negligence, it's institutional blindness. The gap between official and actual populations has grown so gradually that each small increase seemed manageable. Administrative systems adapted to discrepancies that started small and became enormous through decades of incremental growth. By 2015, the prison's official capacity bore no meaningful relationship to its operational reality. Administrators made decisions based on data that described a facility that no longer existed. Guards worked shifts calculated for populations that represented less than 90% of their actual responsibilities. The mathematics of containment had become fiction. The engineering of security had become improvisation. The entire institution operated in the gap between designed capacity and imposed demand. Every day brought fresh evidence that the system was operating beyond its breaking point. Every shift change revealed new mechanical failures and improvised solutions. Every meal service demonstrated the impossibility of adequately feeding a population whose size remained officially unknown. But institutions develop their own momentum. Personnel report for duty because duty must be performed. Administrators file reports because reports must be filed. Maintenance staff improvise repairs because repairs must be improvised. The prison continued functioning not because the systems worked, but because humans found ways to work around failed systems. Not because the infrastructure was adequate, but because people accepted inadequate infrastructure as normal. This is how institutional collapse begins. Not with dramatic failure, but with gradual adaptation to dysfunction. Not with sudden crisis, but with slow acceptance of conditions that should be unacceptable. The machine was already breaking. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. The morning of March 15, 2016, began like every other morning at Maputo Central Prison. Guard Captain Rosa Machado arrived at 5:15 to find the overnight shift reports stacked on her desk. 3 fights in cell block B, a broken water main in the east corridor, 2 inmates reporting chest pains who couldn't be transported to the medical facility because the prison ambulance had been inoperative for 6 months. Routine crises, the kind of problems that had become so ordinary that they no longer generated surprise or urgency. Machado initialed each report and filed them in the cabinet where hundreds of similar reports documented years of systematic breakdown. But something was different that morning, not in the reports themselves, but in the spaces between the words. The overnight guards had logged their observations with unusual precision. Times noted to the minute rather than rounded to the nearest quarter hour. Locations specified with grid coordinates rather than general descriptions. The kind of detailed documentation that appears when experienced personnel sense that routine problems might be building toward something larger. The atmospheric pressure had been dropping for 3 days. Not enough to affect weather patterns, but sufficient to influence human behavior in the subtle ways that meteorologists understand but prison administrators ignore. Low-pressure systems increase irritability, reduce sleep quality, and amplify existing tensions. In overcrowded spaces where psychological stress already operates at maximum levels, even small atmospheric changes can push individuals past their breaking points. The overnight temperature had remained above 32 degrees Celsius, normal for March in Maputo, but devastating for ventilation systems already struggling to circulate air through spaces packed with 4 times their intended population. Heat that couldn't dissipate through inadequate cooling systems. Humidity that couldn't escape through blocked ventilation grills. Air that couldn't refresh itself in spaces where every cubic meter held too many human bodies. These weren't extraordinary conditions, they were the ordinary conditions under which Maputo Central Prison had operated for years. But ordinary conditions, sustained at levels beyond system tolerances, eventually produce extraordinary consequences. At 6:30, the morning meal service began 40 minutes behind schedule. Kitchen equipment failures had delayed food preparation, but more significantly, the head cook had called in sick and a replacement couldn't locate the keys to the industrial storage areas. Breakfast portions, already inadequate for the actual population, were further reduced by logistical complications that should have been routine but had become insurmountable. Cell Block D received half rations. Cell Block A received no breakfast at all. The explanation given to guards was that food supplies would be replenished before the midday meal. The explanation given to inmates was that administrative delays would be resolved shortly. Neither explanation was accurate. The truth was that the prison's food service had finally reached the mathematical point where demand exceeded supply by margins that couldn't be managed through portion control and menu substitution. There simply wasn't enough food to feed everyone, and there was no mechanism for acquiring additional supplies until the next scheduled delivery in 72 hours. Hunger, accumulated over months of insufficient nutrition, suddenly sharpened into immediate deprivation. Inmates who had adapted to constant low-level undernourishment now faced complete meal suspension with no clear timeline for resolution. The psychological impact was immediate. Not panic, but a sudden collective understanding that the prison's basic life support systems were failing in real time, that the minimal services they had learned to accept as barely adequate were disappearing entirely. By 8:30, guard supervisor Antonio Silva was fielding questions he couldn't answer. When would food service resume? How long would inmates be expected to wait? What provisions existed for emergency meal distribution? The honest answer to all these questions was that no one knew. The prison operated without contingency plans for complete meal service failure because administrators had never imagined that basic life support systems could break down entirely. They had planned for partial failures, reduced services, and temporary disruptions. They had not planned for total system collapse. Silva found himself improvising responses to situations that had never been anticipated in his training or experience, promising resolutions he couldn't guarantee, offering reassurances based on assumptions that were proving false in real time. The morning count in Cell Block C revealed another crisis layered beneath the food service failure. Overnight, 3 inmates had developed symptoms consistent with bacterial dysentery. Severe dehydration, bloody diarrhea, high fever, conditions that required immediate medical isolation and antibiotic treatment. The prison infirmary had been designed to handle routine injuries and minor illnesses for a population of 800. It contained 12 beds, basic diagnostic equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies adequate for normal medical needs in a healthy population living in sanitary conditions. Maputo Central Prison was neither healthy nor sanitary. Overcrowding had made disease transmission inevitable. Inadequate nutrition had compromised immune systems across the entire population. Poor ventilation had created atmospheric conditions where bacterial infections spread rapidly through enclosed spaces. The infirmary had been operating beyond capacity for years, managing chronic medical needs through triage and temporary treatments that addressed symptoms without resolving underlying conditions. But dysentery represented a qualitative escalation, an infectious disease that could spread exponentially through a population living in conditions that made contamination unavoidable. The prison physician, Dr. Elena Santos, had been requesting expanded medical facilities and increased pharmaceutical supplies for over a decade. Her reports documented the steady deterioration of health conditions throughout the facility, rising rates of respiratory infections, skin diseases, and gastrointestinal disorders. Clear evidence that overcrowding was producing epidemic conditions that exceeded the medical infrastructure's capacity to contain. Her recommendations had been filed, reviewed, and deferred year after year, not because administrators disagreed with her assessments, but because implementing her suggestions would require acknowledging that the prison was operating under conditions that violated basic health and safety standards. By 9:15, the 3 infected inmates had been placed in isolation cells that provided no actual isolation. Spaces intended for disciplinary segregation, not medical quarantine. No negative air pressure, no specialized sanitation procedures, no enhanced medical monitoring capabilities. Quarantine had become another improvisation in a facility where every system had been reduced to improvisation. The infected inmates were separated from the general population by the same barriers used to isolate violent offenders. Their medical treatment consisted of oral rehydration therapy and whatever antibiotics remained in the depleted pharmacy supplies. Dr. Santos understood that these measures would slow disease transmission without stopping it, that isolation cells with standard ventilation systems would contain some infectious particles, while allowing others to circulate through the facility's atmospheric systems, that antibiotic supplies sufficient for 3 patients would be grossly inadequate when the infection spread to 30 or 300. But she implemented inadequate containment measures because inadequate measures were better than no measures. She prescribed limited treatments because limited treatments might help some patients survive. She filed medical reports that documented the facility's inability to respond to health emergencies because accurate documentation was the only tool she had for communicating the scale of systemic failure. The combination of food shortages and disease outbreaks created a crisis that exceeded the prison's capacity for routine crisis management. 2 simultaneous failures that individually would have strained resources now combined to overwhelm every administrative system. Guards found themselves managing hunger protests while implementing medical isolation procedures they weren't trained to perform. Kitchen staff tried to stretch insufficient food supplies while following contamination protocols they didn't fully understand. Medical personnel attempted to treat infectious diseases with pharmaceutical supplies that had been inadequate before the current crisis began. Each system failure amplified the others. Food shortages weakened immune responses, making disease transmission more likely. Medical emergencies diverted staff attention from routine security procedures. Security complications interfered with efficient medical response protocols. By 10:30, the facility was experiencing its first truly systemic crisis. Not a series of separate problems requiring individual solutions, but a cascading failure, where each dysfunction created conditions that made other dysfunctions more severe. The morning shift supervisor, Lieutenant Carlos Ferreira, recognized that routine management strategies were insufficient for the situation developing around him, but he had no experience with non-routine management strategies because the prison had never provided training for scenarios beyond the scope of normal operations. His contingency procedures manual contained protocols for individual inmate medical emergencies, limited food service disruptions, and isolated security incidents. It contained no guidance for simultaneous failures across multiple operational systems. No decision trees for prioritizing responses when every priority competed for the same limited resources. Ferreira found himself making tactical decisions without strategic guidance, choosing which crisis to address first without understanding how that choice would affect the crises he was choosing to address second or third. Allocating personnel and resources based on immediate urgency rather than systematic analysis of cascading consequences. This wasn't incompetence. It was the inevitable result of operating a complex system beyond its design parameters for so long that crisis response had been reduced to reactive improvisation. The prison had functioned in emergency mode for so many years that genuine emergencies could no longer be distinguished from routine dysfunction. At 11:45, the situation escalated from crisis to emergency. The dysentery outbreak had spread to 7 inmates. Food service remained completely suspended with no clear timeline for restoration, and now a new variable entered the equation. The morning shift change had been delayed because the incoming guards couldn't access their assigned posts. The keys weren't missing. They weren't working. Lock mechanisms that had been showing increasing reluctance over the previous weeks had finally reached mechanical failure. Doors that had required persuasion now required force. Security systems that had been unreliable had become non-functional. Guard posts that should have been staffed by 11 o'clock remained unmanned at noon because the personnel assigned to those posts couldn't unlock the doors that provided access to their workstations. Critical security checkpoints became bottlenecks where guards gathered to collectively solve mechanical problems that individual expertise couldn't address. The prison security posture, already compromised by understaffing and equipment failures, degraded further as personnel were diverted from active duties to basic infrastructure troubleshooting. Guards who should have been monitoring inmates instead spent their time wrestling with corroded lock mechanisms that had finally exhausted their operational lifespan. By 12:30, Lieutenant Ferreira was facing a compound crisis that exceeded every threshold for normal operations. Medical emergency expanding beyond containment capacity. Food service failure with no resolution timeline. Security systems failing at the mechanical level. Personnel unable to access critical work areas due to infrastructure breakdown. Each problem individually would have required exceptional management attention. Combined, they represented total systemic failure across every operational domain simultaneously. But the most critical factor wasn't any of the specific failures. It was the way these failures were being observed by the prison's population. 4,000 inmates watching their guards struggle with basic mechanical functions. 4,000 people witnessing the gap between official authority and practical capability. 4,000 individuals simultaneously recognizing that the systems containing them were far more fragile than they appeared. The facade of institutional competence was dissolving in real time. The illusion of inevitable containment was being replaced by visible evidence of system breakdown. The psychological barriers that supplemented physical security were eroding as rapidly as the mechanical barriers were failing. Prison security depends on multiple layers of control operating simultaneously. Physical barriers like walls and locked doors. Procedural barriers like counts and inspections. Psychological barriers like the assumption that escape is impossible and resistance is futile. When inmates witness guards unable to open doors, unable to provide food, unable to contain disease outbreaks, the psychological component of security begins to collapse. The belief that the institution possesses overwhelming advantages in any contest of wills starts to seem questionable. By 1:15 in the afternoon, something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere of Maputo Central Prison. Not panic, but a sudden collective awareness that the systems everyone had learned to accept as permanent fixtures of reality were actually temporary arrangements maintained by increasingly desperate improvisation. The guards felt it in the way inmates looked at them during the delayed afternoon count. Not the usual combination of resentment and resignation, but a new kind of attention, the focused interest of people reassessing assumptions they had taken for granted. The inmates felt it in the way routine procedures that had operated smoothly for years were suddenly subject to delays, complications, and mechanical failures. The growing realization that the infrastructure of containment was far more precarious than anyone had previously understood. The administrators felt it in the way problems that should have been manageable were combining into situations that exceeded their capacity for systematic response. The uncomfortable recognition that their contingency plans assumed operational capabilities that no longer existed. Everyone inside Maputo Central Prison that afternoon understood that something was different, that the ordinary failures and routine dysfunctions had crossed some invisible threshold and become something more dangerous. But institutional momentum is powerful. Guards continued their shifts because shifts must be continued. Inmates followed routine procedures because procedures must be followed. Administrators filed reports because reports must be filed. The machine continued running even as its most critical components began to fail. The system maintained its external appearance of function even as its internal reality approached complete breakdown. No one wanted to acknowledge what everyone was beginning to understand: that 50 years of deferred maintenance, systematic overcrowding, and administrative neglect had finally exceeded the margins that separate institutional stress from institutional collapse. The walls were still standing. The doors were still locked mostly. The guards were still present, though not always where they were supposed to be. But underneath this surface continuity, Every assumption that made prison operations possible was being tested by circumstances that those assumptions had never been designed to withstand. The breaking point was no longer a distant possibility. It was an immediate reality, waiting for the right combination of stress, opportunity, and collective recognition that the barriers containing 4,000 people were far more fragile than anyone had ever admitted. 2:17 in the afternoon. Guard Station 7 in the northeast corridor of Cell Block D. Corporal Raimundo Joaquim inserts his key into the security gate that provides access to the exercise yard. The key turns halfway, then stops. He applies pressure. The mechanism resists. He withdraws the key, examines it for damage, reinserts it. Same result. This isn't unusual. Joaquim has been working around reluctant locks for 6 months. He reaches for the small hammer he carries for percussive maintenance. 3 sharp taps on the lock housing. The sound echoes through the corridor like gunshots. 43 inmates waiting for exercise period turn toward the sound, not with the usual indifference they show toward routine mechanical difficulties, but with sudden, focused attention. They've been watching guards struggle with basic equipment all day. They've seen breakfast service fail completely. They've witnessed medical emergencies handled with improvised solutions. Now they're watching a single guard, alone at his post, unable to perform the fundamental task of opening a door. Joachim tries the key again, still frozen. He taps the lock housing harder. The inmates move closer to the gate, not aggressively, but with the collective interest of people sensing opportunity. The psychological dynamics of prison security depend on maintaining the appearance of effortless control. Guards must seem to possess unlimited access to resources and overwhelming technological advantages. Inmates must believe that resistance is futile and containment is absolute. When a guard spends 5 minutes wrestling with a lock while 43 inmates watch him fail repeatedly at a task that should take 5 seconds, these psychological foundations begin to erode. Joachim calls for assistance on his radio. The response is static. He tries again. Still static. The radio system, like every other technological infrastructure in the prison, has been degraded by years of deferred maintenance and tropical humidity. He's alone with a mechanical problem he can't solve and a communication system that doesn't work, being observed by 43 people who are beginning to understand that his authority depends entirely on equipment that's failing in real time. At 2:24, Joachim makes a decision that will be analyzed and debated for years afterward. He abandons the locked gate and walks to the nearest functioning telephone to call for maintenance assistance. Standard procedure when mechanical systems fail. But standard procedure assumes that inmates remain contained while guards address infrastructure problems. It doesn't account for what happens when the infrastructure problems are the containment systems themselves. For the first time in the operational history of Maputo Central Prison, a security gate stands unguarded with inmates on both sides of a barrier that everyone knows is malfunctioning. The inmates don't rush the gate. They don't test the lock mechanism. They don't do anything that would be captured on security cameras as aggressive or threatening behavior. Instead, they simply remain in the area, ostensibly waiting for the exercise period that can't begin until the gate functions properly. But their presence is no longer passive. 43 people maintaining visual contact with a failed security barrier, while the guard responsible for that barrier seeks help elsewhere. 43 people simultaneously discovering that prison security gaps exist and persist long enough to be fully observed and mentally catalogued. At 2:31, Maintenance Supervisor Pedro Nkomo arrives with a toolkit and 15 years of experience coaxing cooperation from reluctant prison hardware. He examines the lock mechanism, identifies the problem as a seized tumbler spring, and begins the delicate process of mechanical rehabilitation that has kept the prison functioning despite complete infrastructure breakdown. The lock responds to professional attention. The spring ungrapes, the tumbler rotates. The gate opens. Exercise period begins only 47 minutes behind schedule. Joachim resumes his post. The inmates file through the gate into the exercise yard. The incident is logged as routine mechanical maintenance and filed with hundreds of similar reports. But something irreversible has occurred. For the first time, a significant population of inmates has witnessed complete security system failure and observed how long it takes to restore function. They've seen a guard abandon his post because he couldn't perform his basic duties. They've watched institutional authority dissolve into mechanical helplessness. Most importantly, they've learned that prison security depends on the continuous operation of systems that frequently don't operate at all. Word travels through overcrowded cell blocks with the efficiency that only desperation can achieve. The story spreads and evolves. 43 witnesses become 200 storytellers. A 7-minute security gap becomes an hour-long system failure. A mechanical malfunction becomes evidence of total institutional breakdown. But the essential truth remains unchanged through every retelling. The barriers that separate inmates from freedom are far more fragile than anyone had previously understood. At 3:15, a similar incident occurs at Guard Station 12 in Cell Block A. Different gate, different lock, different guard. Same result: mechanical failure that requires maintenance intervention, while inmates observe security systems operating beyond their operational limits. This time, the response is faster. Maintenance personnel reach the scene in 12 minutes instead of 17. The lock mechanism yields to professional repair techniques. Normal operations resume with minimal delay, but the psychological impact is amplified rather than diminished. 2 mechanical failures in the same afternoon suggest systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. Pattern recognition kicks in among populations that have learned to identify small changes that might signal larger opportunities. 3:47. Guard Station 3 in Cell Block B. Lock mechanism failure. Unguarded security gate. Maintenance response time: 23 minutes. 4:12. Guard Station. 18 in the administrative corridor. Key completely sheared off in the lock housing. Gate inoperable until replacement hardware can be installed. Estimated repair time: 48 hours. 4:36. Multiple reports of lock problems throughout the facility. Maintenance staff overwhelmed by simultaneous mechanical failures across systems that should have been replaced years ago, but have been maintained through improvisation and increasingly desperate repair techniques. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Maputo Central Prison was experiencing infrastructure failure at a rate that exceeded the institutional capacity for repair and restoration. Not gradual degradation that could be managed through routine maintenance, but cascading mechanical breakdown that required resources the prison had never possessed. The maintenance workshop contained tools and spare parts adequate for normal wear patterns in properly functioning systems. It was not equipped to handle simultaneous failure of dozens of lock mechanisms that had been operating beyond their design parameters for decades. Maintenance supervisor Nkomo found himself managing a mechanical crisis that required complete system replacement rather than component repair. Lock mechanisms so badly corroded that restoration was impossible. Springs so metal fatigued that they couldn't hold tension. Key blanks that no longer matched the warped profiles of tumblers worn down by years of forced operation. The prison's security was failing at the molecular level. Steel returning to iron oxide. Springs losing their elasticity. Mechanical tolerances expanding beyond functional parameters. But the most critical failure wasn't mechanical, it was perceptual. The accumulated weight of witness testimony was converting individual incidents into collective understanding. 4,000 inmates simultaneously recognizing that prison security operated through systems that were designed to contain 800 people and were now failing under the stress of containing 5 times that population. The evening meal service, scheduled for 6 o'clock, was delayed indefinitely. Kitchen equipment failures had compounded throughout the day. Food preparation areas remained contaminated by the dysentery outbreak. Staff assignments had been disrupted by personnel reassignments to address security system failures. For the second time in 12 hours, inmates faced meal service suspension with no clear timeline for restoration. Hunger, already acute from the missed breakfast, sharpened into genuine physiological distress. The combination of mechanical security failures and basic life support breakdowns created a psychological atmosphere unlike anything in the prison's operational history. Not the slow accumulation of routine dissatisfactions, but sudden recognition that institutional control was dissolving in real time. At 6:30, the prison's population reached a collective psychological threshold that had been building for years, but crystallized in a single afternoon of visible system breakdown. The point where accumulated stress, immediate deprivation, and witnessed evidence of institutional fragility combined to overcome the psychological barriers that supplement physical containment. It began in cell block D, where the afternoon's first lock failure had occurred. Not a planned action, but a spontaneous test of institutional response capacity. 3 inmates approached the gate where Corporal Joaquim had struggled with mechanical failure for 7 minutes. They didn't attempt to force the gate or attack the guard. Instead, they simply requested permission to return to the exercise yard to retrieve personal items they claimed to have forgotten. A reasonable request that required the guard to demonstrate that his equipment was now functioning properly. Joaquim inserted his key into the lock mechanism that had been repaired 4 hours earlier. The key turned smoothly. The gate opened. The inmates retrieved their items and returned to their cells without incident. But 40 other inmates had watched this transaction with intense interest. They had seen the same lock that failed completely in the afternoon now operating normally. They had observed the repair process that restored function. Most importantly, they had confirmed that mechanical failure creates predictable gaps in security coverage. The test was repeated at 6:45. Different inmates, different rationale, same essential question. Were the lock mechanisms now reliable, or were they still vulnerable to the stress factors that had caused widespread failure throughout the day? This time, the key stuck halfway through its rotation, not completely frozen but resistant enough to require the hammer-tapping technique that inmates had been observing all day. The guards successfully opened the gate after 90 seconds of mechanical persuasion, but the delay confirmed what everyone was learning to expect. The repairs were temporary. The systems were still operating beyond their limits. The mechanical failures that had created security gaps throughout the day were likely to recur without warning. By 7 o'clock, similar tests were occurring throughout the prison. Not coordinated resistance, but distributed inquiry. Hundreds of small interactions designed to assess the current state of security systems that had demonstrated their unreliability repeatedly over the preceding 6 hours. Each test revealed the same essential truth. The prison's containment systems were operating in a state of barely controlled failure. Mechanical barriers that functioned intermittently, electronic systems that required constant troubleshooting, human procedures that depended on equipment that couldn't be trusted to work when needed. The psychological shift was complete. 4,000 people had simultaneously discovered that their containment depended on systems operating far beyond their design capabilities. That the authority exercising control over their lives was improvising solutions to problems that had no sustainable solutions. Prison security had been revealed as an elaborate performance maintained by human determination rather than technological superiority. The guards were working harder than ever, but their efforts were increasingly visible as desperate attempts to maintain an illusion that everyone now understood was exactly that, an illusion. At 7:37 in the evening of March 15, 2016, the first deliberate test of institutional response occurred. 23 inmates in cell block C approached their guard station and politely requested that the gate to the main corridor be opened so they could access the library. The library had been closed for over a year due to staffing shortages. Everyone knew this. The request wasn't serious, it was an experiment. A way of determining whether guards would attempt to enforce regulations using systems that had been demonstrably unreliable throughout the day. The guard, Sergeant Maria Silva, attempted to explain why the library wasn't available. The inmates listened politely, then repeated their request. They weren't demanding or threatening. They were simply insisting that proper procedures be followed. Silva reached for her keys to demonstrate that the library gate was locked and that she couldn't provide access even if regulations permitted. The key wouldn't fit into the lock mechanism. The tumbler had shifted during the day's repeated mechanical failures, and the keyway was no longer properly aligned. For the third time in a single day, Inmates watched a guard unable to perform the basic mechanical functions that prison security requires. But this time, the mechanical failure prevented the guard from demonstrating why compliance with institutional rules was necessary. The inmates didn't challenge Silva's authority or question the library closure. They simply waited while she struggled with malfunctioning hardware, then pointed out that if the mechanical systems weren't working, perhaps the regulations that depended on those systems weren't working either. At 7:51, Silva called for maintenance assistance. At 7:58, she called for supervisory support. At 8:04, she requested additional guards to help manage a situation that hadn't become threatening but had become unmanageable through normal procedures. By 8:15, 12 guards and 3 maintenance personnel were working to resolve a mechanical problem that would have taken 5 minutes to address if the prison's infrastructure had been properly maintained. But the real problem wasn't mechanical, it was mathematical. The prison was trying to contain 4,000 people using systems designed for 800. Every component was operating beyond its limits. Every repair was temporary. Every solution created new problems that required additional repairs. The machine was finally breaking down faster than it could be fixed, and everyone inside the machine understood that the breakdown was accelerating. At 8:27 in the evening, the lights went out.